Welcome to Decades of Heistory, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 to U.S. involvement in World War II. It's March 1926. Gunfights, aviators, East Coast and West Coast gangs, Rum Row, connections to older stories and more. That's March 1926 and Decades of Heistory. Off to Indianapolis, Indiana, where we learn that two youths with, quote, false whiskers, smudged faces, and portentous guns, end quote, held up a bank in Willowbrook, Indiana, which is in Hancock County. When? Well, the other afternoon. Since the Indianapolis Times was dated March 15th, we can assume it was somewhere between the 11th to the 13th, but those details weren't included in the article. Per the article, and despite the bank alarms screaming, quote, lustily, end quote, the pair, so we know it was two youths, escaped $1,700 richer. The author noted that this was the second recent robbery, and referenced a Southport State Bank robbery, which was actually done by the Hostetter gang, as chronicled in a February 1926 episode of Decades of Heistory. Said author noted the Indiana Bankers Association's vigilante squads and the growing incidence of robbery in the general area of Indiana. We've already seen it's also taking place at this time in Illinois, specifically around Chicago, and also out in LA. Funnily, in a kind of maybe a dark way, apparently the Indiana Bankers Association had worked to get banks to install alarms, which makes sense, but also poison gas deterrents, which sounds incredibly dangerous. Well, after all that, it turns out that the Indiana Bankers Association vigilante squads weren't authorized or mandated, however that went, to operate in Hancock County. So all of that reference in the article was actually moot pertaining to this specific bank robbery. Typical of the time, the writer editorialized that numerous different techniques had been employed in the area to prevent bank heists, quote, except putting salt on their tails, end quote, which I assume meant shooting them with rock salt. Said writer also suggested maximum sentences and keeping bank robbers in prison for the entirety of their sentence. But what was left out of the article? Well, for starters, who were the robbers? Were they caught? Were they sentenced? No idea yet. But remember, this is only March of 1926, so more to come on these guys. More on the fallout of this robbery in future episodes. And since we're in Indianapolis and we've referenced the Hostetters, we can follow up on a little bit more of their exploits that, again, were mentioned in a previous February episode. Last we knew, two of the three Hostetter brothers had been arrested and then escaped from a Laredo, Texas jail by sawing the window's iron bars and climbing out the window. Their partner, Kenneth Reeves, was actually caught by the ankles and dragged back in as he was attempting to make his escape. Those three had been rumored to have been involved in the San Antonio, Texas robbery, which according to the Brownsville Herald was the first bank robbery in the city in 5 years. Per that article, three men were partially masked. They entered with shotguns threatening the patrons and the employees alike at around high noon, which seems a little bit dramatic, but maybe it was an enhancement for the article. Rifling through the bank, they gathered up stacks of new bills totaling, at the time they said, over $50,000. And this $50,000 stacks of dollar bills were actually sitting on a counter. So they grabbed the money and dashed out the back door. It was unknown at the time if they had an automobile waiting for them to help with their escape. They assumed later that there was not a vehicle and that therefore they had gone somewhere on foot and were probably most likely still located somewhere within San Antonio. Now that was the Brownsville Herald. If we go to our favorite newspaper for alliteration, the Douglas Daily Dispatch, they actually did some fact checking, followed up the next day with some clarification. Number one, it was $19,138 that was taken, not $50,000. Number two, it was 4 robbers, not 3. According to the Douglas Daily Dispatch, it was the first robbery in 6 years, not 5. So fact checking, or so was this in fact the Indianapolis, Indiana robbers, the Hosteters, who we know in the future will run roughshod across America, for at least for the next year or two to come. Well, like the previous story, more to come on this as facts emerge. So we can stay in Texas for a follow-up on, with a short note on the Yancey Story. Yancey Story was a criminal robber who we mentioned in a previous February episode as well. I believe that this court case that the article references is related to the robbery that we covered in Krum, K-R-U-M, Texas. And it turns out that this court proceeding was being postponed. Apparently an important witness was ill, and so they were going to postpone from March 30th of 1926 to July 2nd, 1926. So significant delay or postponement. So Judge L.H. Jones had previously dismissed a case against W.A. Martin, Cal Wilkinson, and another Wilkinson whose first name was not given. That trio had been alleged to have helped Yancey Story in a robbery of a Holland, Texas bank, but not enough evidence was available, so that case was dismissed. So just a short note on Yancey Story and alleged accomplices, and we'll continue to follow up because this case seems to drag along the exploits and cases of Yancey Story and gang. But for now, we can head west. We've been in Indiana, we've been in Texas. Now we'll head west to California for our next new bank heist of 1926, and what may turn out to be the world's shortest successful bank robbery in history. Gene Thomas, a man, J-E-A-N, Gene Thomas, age 32. He entered the Southern Trust and Commerce Bank on March 27, 1926. 5 bank employees and 1 customer were forced to lie down on the ground, face down, while he scooped money from behind the teller's cage. During his departure, 2 other customers and an additional employee were actually forced into the bank's vault, and one Margaret Fox Hines, a school teacher, had the poor timing of entering during the robbery. So Gene Thomas shoved her and pistol whipped her in the head and shoved her in the vault to join the other 3. 3 hours later, Thomas was leaving a hotel in La Jolla, California, which was about 14 miles or so north of the robbery site, which took place somewhere in the San Diego area, to my knowledge. His suitcase was laden with over $9,000 in currency. He'd actually stolen $10,000 from the bank and somehow managed in 14 miles and 3 hours to dissipate $1,000. He was arrested, confessed to the heist, and so we'll follow up on him as well when we find out the kind of the resolution of him traveling through the court system there for armed bank robbery that involved the physical harm of at least one patron. Since we're in California, we'll stay here for the next 2 stories, both of which are pretty crazy in a way. The first one, Minette Desmond Morrison, was a 21-year-old stenographer. She met a lad named James Kelly at a party. 4 hours into their having met at the party, quote, he won her over, end quote. They were married in 8 hours, and 12 hours later, they were arrested and in jail. The police determined that they were going to prosecute the groom, but not the bride. The groom, whose actual given name was James Wesley Morrison. His charges? Financing their marriage with worthless checks. Interestingly, this bad check writer confessed that he had been implicated, to what degree we don't know, in a 1921 Kansas City, Kansas bank robbery, and that he had, quote, some part in the Hellman Bank robbery in L.A. last year, end quote. We've covered Hellman Bank several times, so I'm not sure which of those robberies it is, but we may be as high as 9 bank robberies in the LA area of the Hellman Bank. And we've only been chronicling the bank robberies starting in 1926, so Jan, Feb, and now into March. And we've encountered 9 bank robberies of the Hellman Bank in the LA area. So like most of the previous stories, we'll try and keep an eye out for Minette Desmond and her husband, how he travels through the court system, and does she kind of disappear from history, or does she reunite with him? No telling yet. Again, it's only March of 26. But for now, we're staying we're staying out in California, and we actually look at a newspaper from the East Coast, the New Britain Daily Herald. On March 20, 1926, the Daily Herald had a pictorial spread on one of their pages. One of the stories was about a dashing aviator and his moment of fame, I guess, as a witness in a courtroom. It appeared that our LA aviator R.C. Warren was somewhere and noticed that a person had an automatic weapon held in the direction of a bank teller. If he was across the street, my assumption is this aviator had excellent vision. And guts, I would say, as well. He didn't hesitate when he saw this. He crossed the street, he ran into an oil station, which I assume is what today we would call a gas station or petrol station. He seized another automatic weapon, with which he promptly, quote, opened fire on the thugs, end quote. One of them was hit or shot down, according to the article, while the other just simply dropped the $1,500 that they had successfully stolen from the bank. According to the short blurb that went with the photograph, the aviator never even mentioned his exploits to anyone. He just kind of disappeared until the trial. So obviously someone knew. So you're asking which bank? It's clearly irrelevant to the author of the article. When? Where? Why? How? All irrelevant facts. I guess what matters is there's a cool photo of an aviator and kind of a pretty fiery story including automatic weapons and a gunfight. But the facts are missing. So if more of this comes out as we make our way along through 1926, we'll add to it. All right. Since we're on the West Coast, we'll stay out there. We'll head north to Washington, where we'll meet a notorious gang called the Kilbourn, Kilbourn, Kilbourn Gang. By 1926, we're pretty much in follow-up mode on them. They've already been perpetrating a lot of activity out in Washington. There was a recent, from our perspective, a recent robbery, and that took place June 5th, 1925, and it was the State Bank of Bothell. That robbery netted them $2,500, but came at a significant expense, because it appears that members of the gang, James Pollock and George Jones, were killed during the robbery, and that one of the gang's important leaders, Alva Kilbourn, was wounded. So we see what they've been up to. Now we kind of come forward to present day. We're in March of 1926. And we hear that Frank Kilbourn, Alva's brother and a member of the gang, had been found in a car by the police. Behind the wheel was a 20-year-old woman named Bernice Delaney. The police pulled her over, and when they came and saw what was going on, she claimed that Frank had been shot in an ambush just outside the city. The unnamed city, according to the Alaska Daily Empire article. I'm assuming by other details it's Seattle, Everett, somewhere in that area of Washington. But for reasons that are mystifying, I think, to us in the 21st century viewers, police took the wounded Frank Kilbourn to their police station in Everett, Washington, instead of to a hospital. So it's no surprise that Frank died. According to the police, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot. That part seems a bit fishy. Nevertheless, he became the third member of the gang to die within recent history. Meanwhile, Alva Kilbourn, his brother, was on his second trial. This one taking place in Seattle, Washington, and specifically for the Bothell Bank robbery. At the conclusion of the trial, Alva was sentenced to a term of 26 to 36 years at the Walla Walla prison. So the Kilbourne gang was reported to be about 15 members. So 3 killed, 1 imprisoned, 11 remaining. And so it'll be interesting to see if their exploits continue, the 11 member gang, if they retain the Kilbourne name, if there's another Kilbourne still involved. So we'll have to track, we'll keep an eye on them as we move forward. Curiously, a more contemporary paper, the Seattle Times, published an article in October of 1998, the 15th. The article was titled "The Birth of Bothell," so Bothell, Washington. In this article, it had the kind of the strange goings-on of Bothell's history from 1886 up into the 1960s. One note stated that, quote, "The Bothell State Bank on Main Street was considered impregnable after fending off 2 bank robbery attempts during the late 1920s. That changed in 1945 when it was robbed of $45,000, end quote." So we're going to need to look for clarification on this, on the Bothell heist, because that goes contrary to what was being reported by the contemporary papers of the time in 1926, referencing the successful robbery in 1925 of that bank. Anyway, we'll look for clarification as we go and future endeavors by the remaining gang members. In the meantime, let's head back east. We'll take a detour to Chicago, Illinois, where we get to meet a very successful criminal nicknamed Three-Fingered Jack. Apparently he wore a glove with 2 of the fingers kind of stuffed in to conceal that he was missing two digits. Which ones, we don't know. Well, so who was he, this Three-Fingered Jack? His actual name was William J. White, and I'm assuming that the J for his middle name was Jack, so William Jack White. Just a guess. When we encounter him, he's in custody in Chicago, Illinois. For now, White, quote, "alleged slayer of a motorcycle policeman," end quote, was believed to have participated in at least 8 robberies netting nearly $250,000. Based on some other articles, the officer most likely was Edward Plaume, Plaume, an officer out in the suburbs who was killed on December 13th, 1925. 3 witnesses identified White as Plaume's murderer. White, a previously paroled ex-convict, was identified and considered a, quote, super bandit, end quote, for his engineering of daring robberies, one of which included a payroll heist of the International Harvester Company, which netted them nearly $80,000. Now, White didn't focus just on farm implement companies for his robberies, like International Harvester. He was also credited with the successful robberies of Chicago area theaters. Those robberies of 2 theaters netted $10,000 each time. And I'm not sure if those were just considered easy jobs or maybe too small to only net $10,000 each. But for some reason, White and gang returned and hit International Harvester Company again. That second robbery garnered them nearly $35,000. So what qualifies him, however, for this channel, Decades of Heistory, is his participation in the $25,000 bank heist of the McHenry, Illinois State Bank, along with 3 other, at least as of yet, unnamed bank robberies. The additional 3 bank robberies netted $65,000, with $52,000 of that coming from one bank alone, which was the Drovers State Bank of Chicago. You kind of go back a little bit. When White was arrested in a suburban roadhouse, he was captured with, on his person, 4 revolvers and a shotgun in hand. After the arrest, they took White, they put him in a car. Somebody took him away to the station. The police waited around for one of White's accomplices, they called him a pal, named Tommy Shupe, Shupe, who was wanted for his involvement in the McHenry Bank robbery and I think both of the International Harvester jobs. At some point, Shupe did arrive at that roadhouse because, according to some of the articles, there was some sort of car chase and Shoup ended up, quote, apprehended after a chase in which his car was wrecked, end quote. 2 of Three Finger Jack's other accomplices were identified as complicit at least in one of the International Harvester robberies, and were actually held when the grand jury convened on March 23rd of 1926. Those robbers were James Gentile and Joseph Leopold. According to the Washington Times, a Washington, D.C. newspaper, the cashier of McVicker's Theater identified White as the gloved bandit who robbed him of $10,000 on January 2nd, 1926. And speaking of a successful identification, White was also identified as the leader of the McHenry bank robbery gang, who hit that bank in October of 1925 for $18,000. And there's a slight discrepancy in the amounts that were attributed to that robbery. The Washington Times stated $18,000. The Evening Star, also a D.C. paper, said $25,000. So somewhere between $18,000 and $25,000 for that particular robbery. But again, we're talking at least 8 robberies and $250,000. In all, police believe that they could actually connect Three Finger Jack to $500,000 in robbery loot total. So for sure, more to come on Three Finger Jack, how he travels through the court system, and also his presumably fully fingered fanatical fellow bank robbers in his gang. We'll see how they filter through the system. And before we continue our way east to Connecticut and close out March of 1926, we'll take a slight detour and head to the tropics and Rum Row. According to the New Britain Herald, a police station sat a mere 40 yards away from some sort of bank vault in Nassau, Bahamas. Perhaps the police were more focused on the docks where boats departed for nearby Rum Row to pick up or to offload illegal Prohibition-era alcohol. But whatever was happening there with the police and their focus, the vault that was 40 yards away from the police station was actually blown. And the robbers hauled away 3/4 of a ton of gold and silver for an enormous heist at the time. It was a very small article. Again, lots of detail was left out. But for sure, we'll try and follow up and see if these guys got away with 3/4 of a ton of gold and silver, or if they're caught and then processed through the court system. But to conclude, as promised, we're heading to the Nutmeg State, Connecticut. This is a very convoluted legal drama that was unfolding in the state capital, Hartford, Connecticut. The state's attorney, Hugh M. Alcorn, stated that he had evidence against one Gerald Chapman, who was already a convicted murderer, post office robber, and bank robber, and leader of the Chapman Gang. Now, the name may be familiar. Chapman is well researched and recorded online with lots of different selections of information. His nicknames included the Count of Gramercy Park, the Gentleman Bandit, and Gentleman Gerald, making him sound like a nice guy. However, it seems more like that gentlemanly air and even a fake aristocratic English accent that he employed sometimes was an act to fool people to gain their trust. He also employed, aside from those nicknames, a handful of aliases as well. Also, and especially interestingly, Chapman was the first criminal to earn the title of Public Enemy #1. His story appears in True Detective magazines, contemporary and retrospective newspaper articles, and even books. One of Chapman's mentors and partners was George Dutch Anderson, who was another notorious gang leader. So this Chapman is really a trendsetter for the Public Enemy #1 and for this channel's robbers who become more and more famous as we go along. Well, it turned out that Chapman, who was under arrest and on trial, had his hopes pinned on a witness named Charles William Gregory, who was also an ex-con and former member of that same gang. And at the point in March of 26, he's considered a missing witness. It seems like Gregory had telephoned Chapman's attorney, a man by the name of Mr. Grohl, Groehl, from a small upstate New York town, telling Grohl that he, Gregory, would be an alibi witness for Chapman. But previous to the article having been written, about a week or so before the article was written, Gregory traveled from that town in upstate New York to Hartford with a Nathan O. Friedman, who was part of Chapman's counsel. While there, they traveled to the state prison in Wethersfield, where Gregory identified Chapman as the man with whom Gregory rode a train from Springfield, Massachusetts on October 11th of 1924 with a very specific time frame involved. He said between 4:10 and 8:15 p.m. So apparently this Gregory had an impeccable memory, because now we're talking about a couple years ago and he remembers the specific times. But coincidentally, and possibly leading us to assume that Gregory is lying, so early that next day, a foot patrolman named James Skelly was killed during a store theft. And if Gregory's alibi was true, it would have been impossible, and this is what Chapman's attorneys claimed, for Chapman to have killed the officer and been on the train and gotten to New Britain, Connecticut at the time that it was believed that he did arrive home. But here's a wrench to throw into this whole story to make it even more wrenchy. Alcorn, the state's attorney, claimed to have evidence that instead of being on this Springfield train, Gregory was actually employed and at sea on an Atlantic ocean liner. He was working as an assistant storekeeper. So clearly he could not have been out at sea and on a train at the same time. Despite that, Chapman's attorney Grohl claimed, supreme confidence and belief in his client, but I think they need to. I think that's part of the job. Well, as it turned out, Chapman had been sentenced to hang on April 6 of 1926. So we'll have to see next month what happens to Mr. Chapman. But spoiler alert, it's not good for him. And it involves what at the time was called the upright jerker, which was a way of hanging people, a way of hanging a person without using a gallows. So tons of courtroom drama and bank robbing in March of 1926, more antics and follow-ups to come in April of 1926 in a subsequent episode. Thank you for spending your time with Decades of Heistory. Till next time.